Good morning, good morning, good morning, blackdoctor.org family and friends. I'm Dr. Rhonda Mattox, triple fellowship trained, board certified psychiatrist, president of the Arkansas Medical, Dental, and Pharmaceutical Association, and your host of I'm Not Crazy But show. Welcome to this edition. I know that you're wondering why in the world would that doctor name that show I'm Not Crazy, but I'm so glad you asked. As many of you know, as a psychiatrist, frequently I hear, I'm not crazy, but, and then the person will reveal something that is particularly shameful to them that they have been really reluctant to share. And on I'm Not Crazy, but those are the topics that we're addressing. Everything around mental health, emotional well being. And today it's about rejection, abuse, and neglect. As you might imagine, with months of isolation, millions of deaths, and economic hardship resulting in a heartbreaking number of job losses, that is the climate that is fertile for a lot of rejection, abuse, and neglect. And so today, by the conclusion of this show, I hope that you will be able to recognize what abuse and neglect look like and how they show up in clinics and in everyday settings, as well as some strategies for what to do when you see them or when you experience them. As I introduce my guests, do what you always do, rep your city in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. We have some amazingly talented all-star cast with us today. And Dr. Chisara, she is an MD, MSPH, MHS, and she has a bunch of letters after her name, but it translates into she's a pediatrician, an award-winning transdisciplinary poet, McDowell Fellow, Stanford trained, MD from Duke University of School of Medicine, has her master's of public health from UNC Chapel Hill, alum of Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars, and she is the founder of the Joy Well. Now, listen, I know it sounds like she's probably going to be boring, but I promise you she is not. She is diehard, down to earth, and she can translate this stuff into language you can understand. And of course, we have one of our regulars now on the show, Dr. Ron Kennedy Bailey, who is an MD, a psychiatrist over at LSU. They know him as the LSU Health Sciences Center Department of Psychiatry Chair and Assistant Dean of Community Engagement. He has served as Chairman of Psychiatry at Meharry, at Wake Forest Medical School, and he's also been over at the National Medical Association. He has a whole lot, as Dr. Chi does, on her bio, but let's get started. Family, today we're talking rejection, abuse, and neglect. And a part of the reason why we're talking about this is whenever something really major in the community happens, whether it be something child abuse related or even intimate partner violence related, I'm always astonished at some of the women who talk about this being Black love when they're Black and blue and bruised, and it doesn't look like Black love, but they're not recognizing that they are being abused. And many times we say stuff like, why doesn't she just leave? But there's so much tied into not only the domestic violence or intimate partner violence, but also the childhood abuse, to where people don't recognize it. And there's this financial dependence that's a part of it. And so today we're going to get down. I would say the good, the bad, and the ugly, but instead I'm going to say the ugly, the bad, and the worst. Okay.
Love it.
Now, if you are just tuning in, let me just tell you, this is one of those shows that you want to show, that you want to share, and that you want to go back and look at again, and perhaps again, because you will need this as you are encouraging friends who are being abused, or perhaps even yourself. You may actually recognize and see your loved ones in this show. And this is not a judgment show. This is a compassionate way to express what's happening so that we can weigh in and support those that we love. So let's just begin with the words in the show: rejection, abuse, and neglect. What is abuse? What is neglect? And what's the difference between those two? Hi, Georgia Peterkin. Thank you for joining us. Rejection, abuse, and neglect. One of you take one and the other take the other, and let's get it started.
Well, I'll jump in and take the issue of neglect first. I think we start from the end. I am always struck by the fact that many of our patients and families are not aware that the most common reported aspect, I think, of child abuse is actually neglect. So neglect, whether it's in the form of intentionally ignoring a child's basic needs, food, clothing, and shelter, or what I tend to see very often as a psychiatrist is was indirect. It may be viewed as non-intentional. Maybe the
Mm.
individual themselves may have some limitations. Maybe they're clinically depressed or impaired or unable, I think, very often to meet their parental or authoritative responsibilities, and they just very often miss certain cues that children may show all too often that they have needs that are actually not being met. So we should have to have a higher suspicion, I think, in our community about issues of neglect when they occur. We should, I think, if you see something, say something, speak up, and really, I think, come to the defense of children when at all possible, particularly in the issue regarding neglect.
Absolutely. And as you were talking, I thought about competing demands. So many times, many people are living in poverty and they may have two or three jobs. And what is definitely showing up as neglect or not meeting those cues is also perhaps from some of those competing demands. Am I looking at that the right way or am I off a little bit on that?
I fully agree. I think all too often, that's why it says intentional and unintentional. And the non-intentional aspect all too often may occur because the adult also in that setting is either unable or and sometimes unwilling to give up something that may become more important to them. All too often in my profession, people have a chemical dependency problem, a drug abuse problem. They don't realize that it's actually beginning to encumber much of their daily life responsibility, and you have to kind of give something up because of the time and energy and effort and resourcefulness that it takes, I think, to take care of children, or even very often older children or adolescents or young adults. For me, as a forensic person, when legal issues come into play, it particularly, I think, becomes striking because the person very often is addressing, trying to avoid an adverse legal circumstance, be it arrest or conditional release, a probation, parole, those type of items. That puts a lot more in responsibility. It also may at some point adversely affect their ability to work and gainful employment and how their monies or their fiscal matters are managed. Huge issues that I think of great importance. All too often, the issue of neglect of children is overlooked, and it shouldn't be. I think for the betterment of our community and our society.
Thank you for sharing that. So we have a working definition of neglect. What about abuse or rejection, Dr. Chi?
Yeah, so and I just want to add to that neglect piece that this is not to impugn or make families who are in poverty feel as if they are somehow being bad towards their children. Like there's a real fear of child protective services coming after you. Like you're trying to do what you need to do for your family, but things aren't working out. Just like you said, the competing priorities, and that it's necessary for parents to understand, yes, you're doing your best, and then also what are the support systems around that can actually provide help, because it's not everybody is intentionally, like Dr. Bailey said, trying to neglect their child. The systems, the situations, the circumstances that are in could potentially be increasing the risk of that, but it's not necessarily the fault of that's something I want to make sure that people have in their minds, and not think like, oh my god, it's me, it's me. And it's like, we're also aware that there are other things, there are other competing interests, other forces that are working against them. But I just wanted to add that. And then to say about abuse, there are two types, well, not two types, there are three and more, as we're starting to realize. But I'll focus on physical abuse, which is bodily harm to the child or to an adult, to any person, right? That results in bruising, scratching, breaking, fracturing of bones, whatever it may be. That's something that is purposefully inflicted on another human being. That's physical abuse with the intent of debasing, bringing down, making someone to feel low self-esteem about themselves. It's a way to dominate and to subjugate someone else to somebody else's whims. The second is sexual abuse, and that is any sort of sexual contact. That could be mouth to genitalia, that could be mouth to mouth, that could be any sort of intercourse, vaginal, anal, um, oral intercourse that is perpetuated on a minor, on a child. It can be sexual assault, especially when you get into the space of adults. That happens on a person, that is meant again to to exert power over someone or dominion over another person. There's emotional abuse. So we've heard gaslighting happening, like now with the era of 45, I feel like people are now starting to, y'all should understand what 45 is, okay? But with him coming into office, people were more and more understanding this gaslighting, which is essentially making you to doubt your own reality, your own existence. I'm feeling bad in this situation right now. Like, I'm not feeling good, but they're telling me that it's all in my head. And to the title of your show, am I crazy? Like, you start to feel like there's something going on with you. In children, that emotional abuse could be, insulting, name calling, denigrating, those kinds of things. And again, the idea of that is to make the person feel very small so that the person who's committing the abuse feels better about themselves. A lot of this is about insecurity and power.
Great, great definitions. Now, I will say a lot of times people don't, all of us are physicians. People don't come into your office and say, "Hey there, I'm being abused, doctor. Help me." That's not what happens. And perhaps even many times people don't even recognize that there is abuse or neglect that's happening. Certainly, if there is physical abuse, perhaps if there is sexual abuse, yes. But the neglect, the emotional abuse, psychological abuse, that's not always recognized. I'm reminded of one of the cases, a very prominent, I think it was a football player, and it showed up on national news of him abusing physically his girlfriend or wife. And she came out very publicly and was just like, "No, this is what Black love is." And I'm purposefully not saying the name because I unintentionally don't remember the name. But in any event, what was striking to me was that she did not think that was abuse. And so when people show up in your office, they're not coming in saying, "Hey, I've been abused." What does it look like to the friend who is engaging this person, to the teacher who's engaging this child, or to the doctor who's taking care of this human life? What does it look like? What are some of the signs that we should look for?
Well, when children come into, you're right, depending on the age of the child, they're not necessarily coming in to say, like, my mom or dad is doing this, or uncle such and such is doing that, like that may not be what's happening, but you may see some behavioral changes. Parents are busy. They have competing priorities. They're not really always focused on every little change that is happening on their child. That's not to put a judgment on them. But when they come into the office, maybe you're asking about grades and you're noticing something, or the mom says, like, "Oh, they got a D and this is a straight A student." Maybe that's the first sign that you're seeing something. It's not necessarily, maybe the kid didn't like the class, sure, but maybe you're starting to see a trend, right? You can see a kid that is withdrawn or having some other, like, new level of shyness, cowering. Like, there's body language that you can also notice, like, in the clinic, in the schools, that you can see in kids. But I think what is really necessary, especially for the adults in the room when it comes to children, is just to pay attention, most importantly, to their body language. I feel like children in their bodies, there's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Klerk, an MD out of Harvard, who talks about how trauma resides in the body and how the trauma can then present itself in the body. So if we're looking at how a child is presenting, how are they standing? How are they walking? How are they talking? Is that a change? Is there a trend that's going towards more reclusiveness or more openness? Are they being aggressive? Are they acting out in class? Are they starting to say things that you wouldn't otherwise expect from a child? Those are some of the things that you look at to see, like, oh, okay, there might be something going on here. And then you can start to ask or probe questions, ask probing questions, investigate what's happening in their social surroundings, and then go from there.
So I'm hearing pay attention to patterns.
Yes, yeah.
Pay attention to body language. I certainly pay attention to sleep and behavioral changes, if they're more aggressive or more withdrawn.
Right.
Dr.
Bedwetting, yeah.
Wetting the bed, yes.
Yeah.
Nightmares, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just jump in and say I think that all too often in our community, I mentioned part about legal issues, forensic issues earlier.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to see, irritability on the rise, which can certainly, I think, unfortunately, grow into agitation and even aggression. And a marker for us has to be that younger children, I think all too often boys, in my community, black boys, if they show something about aggression, we should initially make sure that they're managed and that
Right.
no one is at risk, themselves
Right.
included, anybody else, but also recognize that there may be a harbinger or a sign that's a child is being abused or harmed on their own, and they've learned to communicate via aggressive acts. If you're in a peer-to-peer setting, if you're in the school or a community activity, in the old days it was YMCA, now it's AAU or sports, over the case may be, aggression can be um, um, considered positive in certain settings. You're not weak, you're not small. You're taking control of the situation. In sports, you very often you may even be dominant or promulgate, I think, a degree of success. But
Mm-hmm.
I've learned that, and I love the part you get somebody in your office, you talk to them individually, which you can kind of get past and break through some of the initial barriers to communication when there's a good therapeutic alliance and they begin to trust in us as professionals in pediatrics and psychiatry. Probably no area is more important, I think, than ours to manage this issue. But to hear what a young person is actually experiencing and what they're feeling, and all too often the feeling, I think, of powerlessness, kind of the
Mm-hmm.
opposite of being powerful or controlled, that somebody else is exhibiting toward them, comes out in an aggressive act toward others. So I think this is a remarkably important topic. I agree with Dr. Smoga. She's right. I think that your topic, Dr. Mattox, is timely. It's an issue that all too often is missed, if not just ignored. And we have, jails and prisons full of people because of this. Persons who started off needing some healthcare orientation or intervention, and they would view what I call DOC, Department of Correction, versus
Mm-hmm.
DMH, Department of Mental Health, and didn't get the help or the treatment that they needed. So I think this issue is remarkably come full circle, and we must be, I think, on top of our game, managing, considering, and teaching others look for these issues in children who may be at risk.
Absolutely. I serve juvenile justice population, and so my population are youth who have or meet at the intersection of mental health and the criminal justice system. And one of the things that I've witnessed is that their trauma goes undetected. And so many of the children or the youth that I serve will tell me their parents died, their grandparents died, someone died, and perhaps somebody made fun of that person or made fun of them, and they got into a physical altercation, and they end up there. And I say, did you receive any counseling? No, nothing has happened. They've just landed here. And so for me, this is a conversation about having a conversation with youth and with caregivers who serve them, because so often I think much of the aggression and can be avoided if we are intentional about prioritizing being proactive when there's a loss, when a parent goes to jail. We're hearing a lot about adverse childhood experiences now and how that can impact your adulthood health. Can we talk a little bit about that? Someone talk to us about what it is and how it shows up in your adulthood. What happens to you in your youth? What happens to you in your mother's womb shows up in your childhood and your adulthood. Would one of you be comfortable speaking to that?
Yeah, in fact, there was a recent study that came out. This is more science level animals, where they showed that a specific trauma had on this earthworm, I believe it was an earthworm, can be seen 10 generations later. So that earthworm gives birth, that earthworm gives birth, that earthworm gives birth 10 times, and you can see the impact of that trauma that was here over here. And they're saying that, and there's other work to speak to the fact that something that happens 100 years ago, 200 years ago, I'm talking about enslaved peoples in this country, can show up 10 generations later, can show up 400 years later to now. And if that's not dealt with, if that is not resolved or reconciled, then we're not going to get to the space of peace in our bodies. That is so important for our sleep, for our health. It's the thing that ends up being that if something happens to you as a child, when you are much older, it shows up as chronic illness. It shows up as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, like all these very common things that we hear about, increased risk of stroke, like mental health issues as well, because of unresolved trauma in the past. And then that gets passed on. And then that gets passed on. And that gets passed on. Specifically to the adverse childhood experiences, there was a brilliant study done, I'm going to say now 2 decades ago, by Dr. Vincent and his team out of the CDC. And what they showed in looking at adults is that those who reported one or more adverse childhood experiences were more likely to have that chronic illness or some mental health issue as an adult, which is astounding. Just one. You know, most people have at least 4. And those adverse childhood experiences are what we've been talking about: the abuse, the neglect, some trauma, bereavement, grief, all of these things that may not have been addressed or resolved as children, then show up in ways in the body as adults that need to be addressed. One way of dealing with it, sure, don't have the trauma when you're a kid, but like, as we've seen, 4 million cases at least every year of children being abused or neglected. So it's happening. What else can we do, you know?
Yeah, I just add, I think that's remarkably timely, and I think it's a point that we have to emphasize, I think, to our communities and all of society really over time, because so much antagonism occurs toward individuals because of how we respond to what may be viewed as minor stressors. They very often are major or substantive stressors, even catastrophic, in part because of this long-term history, I think well said about our Tatsmunga, of prior, what I call systemic, kind of even generational abuse. One of my stories is not a favorite story, but it's an important one. Is I grew up in Beaumont, Texas, about 8 miles from Vidor, Texas. Vidor, Texas, years ago was the part of the seat of the Ku Klux Klan. So a number of bad events around my time growing up, but people who were older than me experienced it much worse. So this one time we were actually driving back, as anecdotal, but I think it's relevant, from Louisiana visiting relatives, and we were going to stop. My uncle was there, and he had been in California many years, so that issue didn't bother him anymore. We went to stop and get gas in Vidor, Texas. And my then about 78 or 9-year-old grandmother broke out in a full cry. I mean, like I've never seen before or since, with a level, I think, of passionate fear and aggravation that until I became a psychiatrist, I was a kid then, I really had never seen in anybody at that point. I grew up in a fairly, stable and middle class family lifestyle. So the reality is, we should be mindful of the degree of severity and intensity, I think, of these prior adverse life experiences. How A, they are chronic; they stay with you generationally. B, I think they're likely to, I think, intermittently pop up at any given time, so others may not be aware what you really are responding to. And third, I think they actually impact so many other aspects of your life. Maybe you don't choose to go away to college. Maybe you don't choose to marry this person. Maybe you don't choose to engage in social activity that you actually would normally want to do, because I think of a fear that others around you may have a great deal of difficulty appreciating. We should be not only mindful, but I think engaged, and give people a chance to, I think, address and talk about these items. And that's what I think the rating scale does. It makes an initial assessment. So you can kind of discuss the fact that these things happen to me, because there are often persons who are afraid and they're embarrassed, as I think Dr. Mattox pointed out. They don't want to volunteer it initially. It's our job, I think, to kind of find that in a safe place, make sure they're aware that it's not their fault, but it is our responsibility, I think, for their future to help them kind of make the kind of progress it takes emotionally and psychologically to grow. Huge issues, I think, for individuals, many of whom we're probably not likely to be aware of. You mentioned domestic violence earlier. I unfortunately particularly see this so often in young women.
Mm-hmm. And as you were talking, I had so many thoughts. And if you are interested in kind of the backstory of what Dr. Chi was talking about with the earthworms in humans, look up the term epigenetics, epigenetics, so that you can get kind of that backstory for how our our parents and our grandparents impact even sometimes the way we respond to stress. As we're talking about ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, some of the things that we're talking about are: did your parent go to jail? Were you exposed to physical violence? Were you exposed to emotional abuse? Did you live, under threat of bodily harm? Were you ridiculed and made fun of? Was someone in your family a substance abuser? Those types of things is what we're looking at. When I give this talk to Black physicians, it's almost like it is such a part of
Right.
our culture
Right.
that it's just like it does not even land because we see it so often. And we're talking about this because people who have four or more are more likely to make unhealthy choices, more likely to perhaps be alcohol drinkers or substance user, IV drug users, those kinds of things. And so you can look at some studies, and I don't want to make this a study thing and get too researchy here, though it sounds like we're going there. But when you look at that, particularly if you are a parent who's watching this, understand that sometimes things are such a part of our community that it's not even considered abuse. It's not even considered trauma. I was taking care of a kid who had witnessed in his neighborhood someone be murdered, and he was 10. He was seeing me because his grades had gone down. It was 3 months into it before I found out he had witnessed this. And the mom didn't think it was a big deal because it happened so frequently. So often, what are the kinds of things that happen so frequently that it is normal for us and it's atypical for the person who's treating us, or who's teaching us, or what have you? But we're not even tuning in to what these babies or boys or men or women have shouldered and the memories that they have. And so we're not even picking up on that. When you start to hear, when I hear nightmares or sleep, many times that's how I'm able to get into perhaps some trauma. What are the things that you all look for? Because those are my two indicators to go deeper. What are your indicators to dig deeper for perhaps rejection, abuse, or neglect? And we've not even dealt with rejection. We've just been dealing with abuse or neglect. So feel free to expand on that.
Yeah, I would say thank you for that. There's so many thoughts going through my head. To answer your question specifically, in dealing with adults who come through my workshops with the Joy Well, what I've always noticed is a bit not just hesitation in speaking until they feel like they're in a trusted, safe space, but tearfulness. I cannot tell you how many, like, off of maybe the littlest thing or something completely unrelated, that tears will start to show. And then the question is, okay, where are those tears coming from? And I don't always ask them to tell me. I say, write it down. Maybe later, like months later, they'll come back and say, like, I was going through this, or I remember this from childhood, XYZ, like fill in the blank with everything you and Dr. Bailey did this morning will come through. And I'm like, that's it. The body is holding on to something and it wants that release. And so oftentimes it's the hesitation and speak. And for me, the tearfulness, to answer your question. But I will say this, because it's what is normal in many of our communities, even I'm getting choked up. Wow. This idea of corporal punishment, this idea of spanking, whipping, flogging, beating, whatever you want to call it. My grandmother used to take a slipper to me. That's not what she did, because my grandmother's too old. But that story is one that makes us laugh, makes us chuckle, but we don't realize what it has done to the body. Imagine being slapped, right? Everybody saw like Will Smith slap Chris Rock and was like, whoa, like whether you agreed with it or not, there was a shock to the system just seeing it. So imagine being a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old. You better get your butt inside this car, smack. What does that do to the stress response in your body? What does that do in terms of how your body then adapts to those kinds of conditions? There's a very important book called Spare the Child by Dr. Stacy Patton. And she is here advocating for us to look at this practice that we have normalized and say that it is okay. That is one of the things we normalize, or that we think is, well, everybody had that and we came out okay. Some of us didn't. We get degrees behind our names. We become CEOs of companies. We become Oprah, right? Like we get to that level. But there was pain in that. There was no, and you cannot say that because of the pain, that's what made you stronger. That's what got you there. That excuses that kind of behavior. That excuses the fact that you just got beat and your body responded with a bruise. Maybe somebody didn't see, but inside your body, the hormones that got released from your brain as a result of that, over and over and over and over. You may say, I only spank my child once a week. That's enough. Once a year, that's enough. Be in a car accident once, you can see how your body responds, right? That's the same kind of blow. I know I got a little off, but I just want to make sure these are things that we normalize, or normalize gaslighting in a romantic relationship, that it's okay that they're cutting you off from your people. Like, oh, that's okay. I saw my mom do it. I saw my dad do it to my mom, my grandmother do it to this. So we think it's normal, but we haven't checked in with ourselves. You know?
And the things that we teach are not always right. I mean, as a kid, I remember being chased and popped upside the head by a little boy, and those are love taps. No, I don't want that kind of love. You know,
no loving back.
Dr. Bailey, you look like you're waiting patiently.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You know, I think you've been including me today, but both you and Dr. Smoker, you guys on top of your game today, so I'm really enjoying all of it. I share similar to Dr. O. I think that the reality, as you have this discussion, one does think about many of our own experiences, I think personally and clinically. I'm doing a lot of work with what I call middle-aged African men now, because some settings that I'm in, I do forensic work, and so much of that work, unfortunately, is with young African males. But the reality is, I'm in one group now. We have a Zoom. It's a national group of guys every Tuesday at 6 p.m. or 6:30 p.m. And the issues that you describe, I think, are manifest. They come out. So I'm really thinking, Dr. Mattox points out, what do we really see? I see middle-aged African men who have success, I think as Dr. Smoker just pointed out, externally, becoming overly jocular in their discussion, becoming overly superficial with the level and nature of what some of these early concerns and not traumas cause for them. I see many who then want to reach out separately. They text you in chat or call you professional, because they want to share what many of the more deeper, more internally debilitating issues may be. And in that setting, all comes out. I love the comment about tearfulness, remarkably timely. I don't see Black men getting tearful in the physical, but I call it tearful, I think, psychologically, emotionally, and what they'll share. All my experience has been, if somebody tries to find some homogeneity or some commonality with me or the group, we're big guys, we're 60 years old, we're successful in a certain setting, we played football, et cetera, et cetera. But in a private conversation, I mean, that's public. In a private conversation, a person will discuss, just like everybody else, what the levels, I think, of weakness and vulnerability and fear may be. I'll end by saying I've said throughout my career, doing 30 years now, that other settings, all too often you hear that Black men, won't go to a doctor or won't talk about the issues of the like, what have you. And my experience has been that I can't get them to stop talking to me, just not in regular formal settings. So I'd encourage all three of us and others as well who listen to this discussion, those who are professional, will have offices, and those who, I see a lot of folks in your chat, they're calling from all over the world. You're popular, Dr. Matt, and rightly so. Hear a person's message. Don't just take that first, I'm good, and walk away. Accept that they may need, I think, to have a second or third bite at the apple to be able to finally really share what the thoughts and concerns are. There's a huge premium on being strong or powerful, better yet, not being weak or vulnerable, and all the unfortunate adverse turns out of that. And we've got a lot of work to do, I think, to make that not be our reality in our community, because disproportionately, it adversely affects person's ability, I think, to function and to grow. It's also key that all too often that secondary message comes from our culture, our family. So the men and women in our family, older and young, have to also recognize this, So otherwise, we won't be able to, I think, move toward early intervention for a young man who may have some degree, I think, of risk, out of a risk, some degree of need. Huge points, but I think the reality is neglect and abuse can happen to all persons of all backgrounds, ethnic and racial, gender and age and alike. And we should be very sensitive to it and try to find ways to address it in an effective way for that patient and that individual.
Yes. And the intersection of masculinity and mental health really can be challenging, because a part of the mental health, mental wellness is to talk. But we have all these memes in our culture of men who are being vulnerable, and we're making fun of them. From Chris Rock and Will Smith, there are pictures of Will Smith in tears. There are pictures when they were talking about the Jada August incident, pictures of Michael Jordan with tears, and they're making fun of him. And so when, we say, be vulnerable, show your humanity. And then when it happens, we don't know how to handle it, and we make fun of it, and we communicate very openly, this is not safe to do. And so how do we, and they feel rejected. And so this is about rejection. And so we have these messages of what strength and weakness is. And when people are talking to me, I'm like, this is not about being strong or weak. I mean, not showing emotion is about a person who's probably about to pop or whatever. So it's about being human, not strong or weak, but being human. And Oliver Twist echoes my emotion. I don't know if you can hear my dog in the background, like going off or whatever. He says, yes, Dr. Mattox, go ahead. But what are some of the solutions to being proactive to prevent this? And I'll throw out one of my solutions. It is for parents to stop telling their children that they cannot communicate disagreement and that be considered dishonor or disrespectful. We have to learn how to communicate at home so that we're not blowing up and being volatile when we have disagreements. And that starts at home. What say you?
Dr. Bailey, you want to go? Yeah.
I'll jump in. I clearly think that it should be at least a three-tiered approach, if not more. By definition, I think as the leader of a household, fathers, mothers, and the like, grandparents in some households, what have you, taking this position or the role to listen to our children and our offspring, I think is essential. And I think all too often it just really doesn't happen. We have intermittent connectedness. We're in the house at the same time, but we're in different rooms, watching different televisions on different, video games, and not really having full engaged conversations that are bi-directional, where we respond to what somebody actually says. I think as well, though, as you point out, I think very, very clearly and very articulately, all too often we don't hear messages that we don't really want to hear. And I speak strongly. I think that we should be mindful of that in families. I think persons all too often will express a mild to moderate degree at best, sometimes only a smidgen of vulnerability. And that's our opportunity to build a therapeutic alliance, whether you're professional or not, or with this family or not, and to give them a chance to say there may be a larger footprint of need of issues to discuss where they're not handling those concerns well. As a prior school psychiatrist about a decade ago or more in my career, I saw this story over and over and over again. Kids, mainly adolescents in that setting, I worked in North Adolescent Hospital, would come to the school and or the clinic with problems that clearly they tried to address indirectly at home, and they just were not being heard. I think all too often the huge pressing demands, I thought upon very articulately earlier, the reality is at times we don't want to feel blamed for our inability to meet some parental responsibilities or authoritative responsibilities because we have tremendous demands at work and finance and XYZ and the like. But it's really probably nothing more important than in our household for there to be an emotional, psychological sense of forbearance and of safety and of care, mutual care, as well as when you're outside. So I think that one strategy that certainly can occur and that we could all take responsibility for is listen to the people who we live with and hear, I think, the degrees of vulnerability and fear if it's there, and give it a chance, I think, to be addressed and understand what they're trying to do with it, and then maybe provide some solution-related strategies or recommendations where you can work along with them and help them grow.
Very excellent points. Excellent. I want to read something that Georgia Peterkin said. I hope I'm saying your name right, Georgia. Society destroyed our men when they were children, forcing them to suppress their emotions and then demanded them to express their emotions as men, forgetting we took it from them as a child. Uh,
Hmm.
well said, Georgia. Well said. Um, well said. Dr. Chi, I know we only have you for just a few more minutes.
Yeah.
So I will give you the opportunity to summarize and make some points to what we've said or anything that you wanted to share that you've not had an opportunity to share just yet.
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important conversation, and I appreciate not only the invitation, but that you're doing this, Dr. Mattox. This is critical. I want to echo what Dr. Bailey said about listening. I'm going to take it a step further and say listening to our bodies, and that is a long process. That's not something that like you will get overnight, but it begins with understanding that the body has signals. Okay. I'm gonna make it real innocuous. You know when you're hungry, right? You know your stomach might growl, you might feel a little achy. Maybe if you wait too long, you're a little dizzy, right? You respond to that signal. You do something about it, right? It's the same thing with trauma. It's the same thing with stress. Like you may be in a situation that's overwhelming. Can you take 7 seconds, a deep breath, center yourself and say, what's going on in your body? Forget everybody else around you because you need to be okay in order for you to be able to be okay to some child, right? 7 seconds, nothing more than that. I'm going to give you 2 more rules about sevens, right? If somebody asks you a question, take 7 seconds to answer, okay? If they're asking, how are you? Take 7 seconds. Even if you just say, I'm fine after, that 7-second period, I don't know if it's sociological studies or what, but in those 7 seconds, people are likely to respond more truthfully, more honestly, or at least to themselves, even if they don't say it to you, right? And also understand that for those of us who are practitioners, for those of us who are in a caregiving situation, you can ask somebody or tell somebody something once and think that's enough. But all the research shows you need at least 7 times. Okay. So I've said 7 times you might have to repeat something, right? For it to stay inside of you. You have 7 seconds. Give yourself 7 seconds to answer a question, right? About yourself. Where am I right now? Give yourself 7 seconds, right? And 7 seconds to hear somebody else. Like I love the number 7. I call it the number of completeness. I'm sure there are other sort of organizations out there that love the number 7 too, but that's just 3 ways to think about how you can listen to your body more, answer your body, answer the call of your body so that you can be in a space to provide support for somebody else. That's how I see it. That's my solution.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Chi, for joining us. For those of you who are just tuning in to I'm Not Crazy, But we are talking about rejection, abuse, and neglect. We'll spend our last few minutes with Dr. Ron Kennedy Bailey talking about resources that are available should you find yourself in this. And I will just say, rep your city, tell us where you're calling, where you're signing in from, drop your questions. I've not always taken a look at it, but I have a producer who will sometimes put your comments on the screen, and go ahead and put us on your calendar for every Thursday, 11 a.m. Central Standard Time, 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Dr. Chi, where can they find you if they want? She does Joy Well, and I need you to just share how people can find you before you hop off.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Mattox. You can find me online at www.livejoywell.com. www.livejoywell.com. I look forward to meeting all of you. And thank you so much, Dr. Mattox, Dr. Bailey. Y'all have a good one.
You're great. Great to meet you.
Now, for those of you who stay, we'll do our last 5 minutes and wrapping up. When there is obviously the trauma that's happened, many times when it happens, we know that if a parent gets divorced, perhaps we should look at getting the kids some therapy. Perhaps if there's been, sexual abuse, or there's some major death in the family, we know that to happen. I think sometimes, as one of our audience members put in there, it can show up in drawings, bedwettings, decrease in grades, more aggression, change in patterns, doing drugs, those kinds of things. When that happens, as a parent, many times you're reluctant to get people in your business. You're reluctant because it feels like a failure on your part if you have to have someone else involved. But when you make the decision to seek help for yourself or for others, where do you start?
Well, I think that this comes full circle for me with the issue of rejection. One of the three terms, I think, in your initial intro for today. I'll take the latter first. I think that where do we start? I think that there has to be some degree, I think, of acknowledgement and acceptance of where that person is. That kind of moves away from a construct where we just simply say, "Are you good?" And they use that term a lot now. "Are you fine? Okay?" And accept and kind of move forward. I think when rejection, I'll say that again, is in play, it's kind of multi-tiered in my impression, Dr. Math. I think persons are rejected from someone who is choosing to not acknowledge them for their relative value or worth. They're also rejected, I think, in that they are choosing to want to be accepted by that person. And that's often what I'll see in my practice, individuals who will continue to pursue activities that put them, I think, in the potential losing or unfortunate psychologically detrimental circumstance by kind of chasing a goal that may not be uh, uh, going forward acceptable or likely to occur or successful. Huge issues for us, I think, and we talk a lot about young kids today, when we should neglect. I think more about, to be blunt, teens and early and late adolescents and early adults now, on the issue of being rejected, and how much antagonism and loss of self-esteem and kind of retribution comes out all too often in young persons in that setting. Now, on one extreme, we do see individuals who will do too much. They'll fight or become aggressive or hostile, and that's one reason it's hard to step on somebody's foot these days. They may over-respond in a negative but almost a potentially violent way. But I'm actually speaking even more so of those that are mid-level, where they feel rejected. They go into a shell. They become isolatory. They stop pursuing the things or activities that they actually choose or interested in. Often psychiatry will use this term anhedonia to address a lack of interest in things that previously were fun or enjoyable. And all too often, if you're not in a setting where clinical depression, for example, is readily acknowledged and a reputable diagnosis in some settings, then something else has to be the case. You mentioned drugs, you mentioned dropping out, you mentioned not going to school or not being able to get your assignments done at work, you mentioned conflict. I think maybe I mentioned conflict at home with authority figures, all issues that I think we see when somebody's having behavioral manifestations of illness and behaviorally acting out. And I think we see it very similarly in younger persons, which is described as such, as well, I think, in generations now of adolescents and young adults who I think generationally currently engage a lot of the same difficulties that we thought historically would happen in younger kids and early adolescence. Why? I think in part, Dr. Mattox, is because there certainly are or is a paradigm or model, in my estimation, where too many individuals fall into a caricature of being overdeveloped in one area, really good academically, really good in sports, really good lifting weights or playing a musical instrument, what have you. But very often psychologically, they may be underdeveloped, if not undeveloped, in many of the aspects of psychological development that leads to emotional growth and maturity. The lack of such, I think, all too often is manifest substantially when then you put yourself on a limb and you're rejected, be it by a person, by entity, by a group. I have a myriad of examples of individuals who don't make a team, be it a school team or let alone a relationship or let alone a promotion on the job. I had a faculty meeting today with grown adults or what have you, and people aren't always happy when they don't get the next opportunity. Therefore, they view that as rejection. So a remarkably important topic that you put in your list for today, and one that I think as for those of us who are in psychiatry, like the two of us are, one that we I think are regularly dealing with and trying to find ways to ingratiate, I think, our patients or our groups to strategies that are more likely to be effective and help them find some emotional balance when these issues of rejection are in play.
And I will say, certainly we've dealt in some of the worst case scenarios as it relates to rejection, abuse, and neglect. But we've also heard, the likes of Michael Jordan, who his coach's rejection of him for the team became his number one driving force for him to overcome. And he accomplished a lot of great things trying to prove to other people that he was good. And while that really worked out well for him, I think there is something about the value of you just being as opposed to receiving your value from doing. And I'm not knocking that because it really worked out. But there is something about just being valued for who you are, for who you are and not what you're doing. And certainly as parents, if you are a parent and you're listening to this, make it a priority to allow your children to communicate with you in a safe place without it being considered disrespectful. Now, certainly you teach them, you can teach them how to communicate so that it's not, but create a place to where our children and young people can communicate in a safe place so that happens. Dr. Bailey, before we wrap up, are there any last comments that you'd like to share?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to reiterate your point. I strongly support it. I clearly think that the relationship, I think, between a parent and a child, or what I consider to say authoritative figures, or at times there's somebody who's not the parent but functions in that role, is just essential and a remarkable, important vector, I think, in all societies, especially I think in our community, here in this country, and in our culture, and in our ethnicity or race going forward, help address some of the ongoing problems that I think have befuddled us. And many may have a point the finger of blame construct. I think that Dr. A mentioned earlier that people should not do so, and she's right about that. We've got to find, I think, a healing sort, psychologically, emotionally, to help, I think, our community heal, I think, and grow. My final comments, I think, are threefold. I think that you made the comment earlier, do we have resources? I'm very proud to be on SAMHSA's advisory committee now, a council now. I have a 4-year appointment, and I've learned a lot. SAMHSA is the biggest federal government arm dealing with mental health. Generally, states pay money or provide money for our mental health services because many of our patients are indigent. But SAMHSA has come out now. We spent a couple of years on this with the 988 number. People should use it. They should know about it. It took a while for folks to understand 911, but the reality is 988 is much more specific for suicide and a mental health arm. I'm optimistic, and part of the plan is to get 988 now and to go forward in the future with other attempts to, I think, get the point out that there are strategies to be used to address mental health concerns. And I think that actually sends a subtle message, or not so subtle message, that mental health matters. And psychiatry is key, and it's an actual aspect, I think, of overall health, brain health, I think, and body health. The second point I mentioned, I think, is also important. Talked a lot on today's discussion. We got a great discussion about going for care. We kept mentioning it, and I think I just share. You can't have a psychiatrist on a discussion like this and not say that you should go and seek care. Our suicide rates have gone up in our society over my career, and yours as well. But the reality is we're seeing increasing suicide rates in demographic groups like women compared to men, and younger women. Adolescent African American women have increased even greater than some other settings. That clearly means that people have to go to see their professional. All too often, when there's a bad outcome, the professional the person saw was their primary care doctor, not a psychiatrist or the like. And that's fine with us, but go and seek care. I strongly encourage it. Find a good community-based setting where you can speak, I think, bi-directionally with a professional who will listen to you, as we said today, who will hear you, and when necessary, when higher level, I think, specialty work is necessary, then refer you to a mental professional with additional degrees, I think, of training and experience. And really, my third and final point is, I think all too often we mix behavior that's clinical with issues that I think are bad. We call it, are you bad or are you mad? And the reality is, all too often in settings, persons need to be viewed as having a healthcare problem and a clinical orientation, I think, to try to address it, versus very quickly our society moving toward being overly heavy-handed, almost militaristic, We're going to arm the police and the authorities, and schools have police and like involved. And with a normal activity that occurs, it's not optimal, but it may be normal for that age individual. We're over responding, I think, in a very hyper aggressive way. As adults, as professionals, we should be the ones to say that's not right. And we should do better with that going forward, especially to improve the lives of our kids. So I'll end by saying topics like rejection, I think, and abuse and neglect are remarkably important. I thank you very much, Dr. Mattox, for including me today and for having these important topics on your agenda.
And thank you for joining me today. Life happens. I thank you for being willing to join us from the airport. In spite of, I will say to you all, if you have recommendations for show topics that you'd like for us to address, go to drrhondamattox.me and leave your suggestion. Next week, we are going to be talking about sex, baby. The title of the show is Let's Talk About Sex, Baby. We're going to be talking about sex throughout the seasons of our lives. And with that is erectile dysfunction, as well as pre-ejaculation, as well as sex after menopause. Yes. So this is a show you do not want to miss. And there will be a part 2, but it won't be right afterwards. We've already planned that. So set your alarms for 11 o'clock a.m. Central Standard Time, 12 p.m. Eastern Time for every Thursday. You do not want to miss Let's Talk About Sex, Baby. Thank you for joining us. Like I said, if you have show topics that you like to see us address, drop your comments drop your suggestions in the comments, or go to drrhondamattox.me if you want it to be more personal or private. I appreciate you for tuning in. I just want to remind you to step outside of your comfort zone and make an impact. And I want to assure you, no, darling, you're not crazy. Bye-bye.